I am Nia, 29 years old, and a forensic accountant who spent my life as the family scapegoat. I came home for Christmas expecting my relatives, but found our massive estate completely dark. The only sound was a rocking chair creaking where my paralyzed grandfather sat alone. A handwritten note on the kitchen counter simply said, "Mom, Dad and your brother flew to Europe for the holidays. You stay and change Grandpa's diapers. Sign his nursing home transfer papers by Friday." I was dialing Adult Protective Services when a firm hand grabbed my wrist. My paralyzed grandfather stood up straight, looked me in the eye, and said, "Let them fly. Shall we begin?" A week later, they returned screaming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you have fought toxic family. The sleet came down in heavy sheets as I pulled up to the wrought iron gates of my family's estate in an exclusive Atlanta suburb. I had packed my trunk with expensive gifts for my parents, my older brother Jamal, and his wife Chloe. I expected the driveway to be lined with luxury vehicles. Instead, the property was pitch black. The security gates were wide open, swinging in the bitter wind. A profound sense of dread settled in my stomach as I hurried up the icy front steps. I unlocked the heavy mahogany door and stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside was freezing, no heat was running. I called out for my mother Vivian and my father Marcus, but no one answered. I turned on my phone flashlight, sweeping the beam across the dark living room. That is when I heard a slow, rhythmic creaking sound from the far corner. I directed my light toward the noise, and my heart shattered. My grandfather Silas sat in his wheelchair, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring blankly ahead. A stroke 2 years ago supposedly left him with severe dementia and partial paralysis. Seeing him abandoned in a freezing dark house on Christmas Eve made my blood boil. I checked his pulse and wrapped my coat around his frail shoulders. I promised him everything would be okay and ran to the kitchen to find the thermostat. When I flipped on the lights, the glare revealed a scene of hurried departure. Half-empty coffee cups sat on the granite counters. Discarded boarding pass printouts littered the floor. Sitting on the kitchen island, weighed down by a bottle of expensive champagne, was a legal folder and a handwritten note on my mother's personalized stationery. I picked up the note. It read, "Nia, we decided we desperately needed a European getaway to clear our heads. Jamal and Chloe wanted a romantic Christmas in Paris, and your father and I agreed we deserved a break. We left the front gate open for you. You need to stay and take care of your grandfather, feed him, and make sure he is clean." Inside the folder are the medical proxy forms and transfer documents for St. Jude's Care Facility. Sign them immediately. We are moving him there on the 2nd of January so Chloe can renovate his wing into a wellness spa for her golden retrievers. Do not ruin our trip by calling with your usual dramatic complaints. Underneath the note was a glossy brochure for St. Jude's. I recognized the name immediately. It was an underfunded state-run facility with a terrible reputation for neglect. They wanted to discard the patriarch of our family into a miserable institution just so my arrogant white sister-in-law could have a dog spa. My hands shook with a rage so intense it made my vision blur. I dialed my father's number. He finally answered. The background noise was loud, the soft jazz and clinking crystal glasses of an international first-class airport lounge. "Nia, I told your mother you would throw a fit," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "What do you want? We are boarding our flight in 20 minutes. "You left Grandpa alone in a freezing house," I yelled. "You turned off the heat. He could have frozen to death. You are abandoning him so Chloe can have a dog spa. Are you insane?" "Stop being dramatic, Naya," my father sighed. "The heat is on a timer. It just needs to be reset. Silas does not even know where he is half the time anyway. He is a burden, and we are exhausted. You are a single woman who just fixes spreadsheets for a living. You have no husband and no real responsibilities. Do something useful for this family for once and handle the paperwork. I am making an executive decision. Do not call this number again until the old man is packed up." The line went dead. I stared at the phone crying. I was not just someone who fixed spreadsheets. I was a senior partner at a massive private equity firm, but my family had spent my entire life belittling my achievements because I refused to flaunt my wealth the way they did. I took a deep breath, wiped my face, and began dialing Adult Protective Services. I was ready to report them. Before the first ring connected, a large, warm hand clamped down firmly over my wrist. I gasped loudly and dropped the phone. I spun around to find my grandfather Silas standing right behind me. He was not weak, and he was not trembling. He stood completely upright, his posture radiating the formidable strength of the self-made titan he had always been. His dark eyes, which had been previously clouded with fake confusion, were now sharp, clear, and burning with an intense, familiar focus. He looked at my dropped phone and then looked directly into my eyes. "Cancel the phone call, Nia," he said, his voice deep and entirely steady. "Let them fly away today. Now shall we begin?" I stumbled backward against the cold kitchen counter, paralyzed by shock. "Grandpa," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "You are standing. You are talking. The doctors said you had severe cognitive decline and could not walk unassisted." Silas calmly picked up my cell phone from the floor, placing it on the island. "The doctors said I had a mild transient ischemic attack," he corrected smoothly, "a minor stroke that I recovered from within weeks. But when I woke up in that hospital bed 2 years ago, I heard your father and your brother arguing in the hallway. They were not arguing about my health, Nia. They were arguing about who would control my bank accounts and liquidate my logistics company to fund their luxury lifestyles. I realized right then that the empire I built with my blood and sweat was going to be devoured by vultures. So I made a choice. I decided to play dead to see exactly which of my family members would try to eat me." I listened in stunned silence as the gravity of his words washed over me. He had spent 2 entire years trapped in his own body by choice, enduring the indignity of a wheelchair and the condescension of his own son just to uncover their true nature. "In this house, dead weight gets dropped," Silas said, his tone hardening. "You know that rule better than anyone, Nia. It is the family mantra." I knew it intimately. Growing up in this affluent African-American household, I was always the scapegoat, while my older brother Jamal was the golden child. I remembered when I was 18 begging my parents for a fraction of my college tuition. They told me I was dead weight and needed to figure it out myself. I worked 3 terrible jobs to put myself through university, while they handed Jamal hundreds of thousands of dollars for endless failed business ventures. When Jamal married Chloe, a wealthy white woman who treated me like the hired help, my parents worshipped the ground she walked on. They desperately craved validation from elite social circles, and Chloe was their ticket. They dropped me because I chose quiet, hard work over flashy country club politics. They thought I was dead weight now. Silas continued, walking past me toward the hallway with purposeful strides. They thought they could strip me of my dignity and throw me into a miserable state facility to die alone while they drank champagne in Paris. He stopped at the entrance to the West Wing and looked back at me. "Come with me, Nia. I need to show you what I have been doing," while they thought I was staring at the wall. I followed him down the long, dark corridor to his private study. The room had been off limits to the family since his supposed decline. My mother had complained constantly about wanting to clear it out, but the door had remained locked. Silas pulled a brass key from his pocket and opened the heavy wooden door. The study smelled of rich mahogany, old paper, and leather. He walked directly to the center of the room and kicked aside a massive antique Persian rug. Underneath, the intricate hardwood floor revealed a hidden panel. Silas knelt, pressed a hidden latch, and lifted the wooden board to expose a large steel safe. He quickly spun the dial with practiced precision and pulled the heavy door open. Inside the safe were dozens of thick, leather-bound ledgers, stacks of bank statements, and manila folders bursting with financial documents. Silas began pulling them out and piling them onto his desk. "They think I am blind," Silas said, a dark smile playing on his lips. "They thought because I sat in that wheelchair with my eyes half closed that I did not see the mail arriving. They thought I did not hear their phone calls. They thought I did not notice the bank statements slowly disappearing from the Daily Post. But I have friends at the bank Nia. Old friends who helped me build my company from a single delivery truck in the segregated South into a massive logistics corporation. Those friends have been quietly sending me duplicate statements every single month. I have been collecting their sins. He handed me the first heavy manila folder. I opened it and my breath caught in my throat. As a forensic accountant who spent her days dismantling corrupt corporations and restructuring bankrupt companies, I knew exactly what I was looking at. It was a trail of massive systematic financial ruin. Look at the third page, Silas instructed quietly. I flipped through the crisp documents. My eyes landed on a stark, bright red bank notice printed on official letterhead. It was an urgent warning of default. I read the numbers and the property description twice just to make sure I was not hallucinating. "Grandpa," I said, my voice trembling as I looked up at him. "This is a notice of active pre-foreclosure. They are threatening to seize this estate." Silas nodded grimly, his jaw set tight. "I paid off the mortgage on this ancestral estate 30 years ago, Nia. I own every brick and every blade of grass free and clear. But your father Marcus took control of my business operations when I supposedly fell ill. He assumed power of attorney, and he has been busy." I stared back down at the red ink on the paper. The document detailed a massive commercial loan taken out against the equity of the estate. It was for $4 million. The payments had been missed for 6 consecutive months. The bank was initiating the legal process to seize the house and sell it at public auction. I looked at my grandfather, realizing the ultimate betrayal my family had committed. They had gambled away his legacy and left him here to die while they enjoyed a luxury vacation. My sadness instantly vanished, turning into an overwhelming thirst for vengeance. I did not waste a single second. I grabbed the heavy stacks of leather-bound ledgers and carried them out of the study, dropping them onto the massive oak dining table. Silas followed me, his footsteps silent and steady on the hardwood floor. He pulled out a chair at the head of the table and sat down, watching me with a sharp, approving gaze. I opened my briefcase and pulled out my Vanguard restructuring encrypted laptop. As a corporate liquidator, I read financial statements the way other people read simple storybooks. Numbers never lie. They do not hold loyalty. They do not play favorites. They simply expose the truth. I spent the next 2 hours completely submerged in the financial wreckage of my family. I cross-referenced the bank statements Silas had secretly acquired with the public corporate filings of the family logistics company. The level of incompetence was staggering. My father Marcus was treating a multi-million-dollar enterprise like his own personal piggy bank. I found phantom vendors created solely to funnel money into offshore accounts. I found employee pension funds diverted to pay for my mother's U.S. exclusive country club memberships and luxury car leases. It was a masterclass in vanity and greed. Then my fingers stopped typing. My eyes locked onto a scanned image of a canceled cashier's check in the personal household ledger. The date was exactly 5 years ago. The amount was $60,000. The memo line was written in my mother's unmistakable cursive handwriting. It read, "Jamal Crypto Startup." My vision blurred with a sudden hot wave of anger. Silas noticed the change in my posture immediately. "What did you find, Nia?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I turned the laptop screen so he could see the digital scan of the check. 5 years ago, I came to my parents begging for help. I had exhausted all my grants and student loans. I needed exactly $60,000 to cover my final year of tuition and my certification exams. I sat in this exact dining room and pleaded with my father. He looked me dead in the eye and told me I was dead weight. He said the family business was cash poor and I needed to learn how to survive on my own. I worked back-to-back night shifts at a greasy 24-hour diner. I destroyed my health sleeping 3 hours a day just to graduate. Silas stared at the screen, his jaw clenching tight. "And while you were ruining your health scrubbing diner tables, they gave that exact amount to your brother." "Yes," I said, my voice dropping to an ice-cold register. Jamal took my tuition money and threw it into a fake digital coin. He blew 60 grand in less than 90 days on luxury dinners and rented sports cars trying to look like a tech mogul. They watched me struggle to survive while funding his delusions. Silas placed his hand over mine. They stole your youth to fund his arrogance, but we are going to take their future. Keep digging. Find the bottom of the wrought. I turned back to the keyboard, my fingers flying across the keys with renewed vengeance. I needed to understand the $4 million pre-foreclosure notice on the estate. Silas had paid cash for this land 30 years ago. For a bank to threaten foreclosure, Marcus had to have taken out an illegal loan. I hacked directly into the logistics company U.S. shadow accounts, bypassing my father's laughably weak security passwords. I traced the routing numbers, and the truth finally snapped into place. It was a house of cards, ready to collapse. "Grandpa," I said, leaning back in my chair, "the $4 million loan against this house did not go to Jamal. It did not go to Mom U.S. shopping sprees either. It went directly into the corporate accounts of the logistics company." Silas frowned deeply. Why would Marcus inject $4 million of stolen equity into a business that was already generating revenue? "Because it was not generating revenue," I explained, pointing to the red deficits on my screen. "Marcus has been skimming off the top for a decade. He drained the operating capital to buy vacation homes and designer watches. 3 months ago, the Internal Revenue Service flagged the company for an audit. Marcus panicked. He had a massive hole in the corporate accounts and the auditors were coming. So he forged your signature on a home equity line of credit. He stole $4 million from your estate to patch the hole in the business accounts before the federal auditors could find out he was embezzling." Silas let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He committed mortgage fraud to cover up his corporate embezzlement. He risked the roof over our heads just to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. "It is worse than that," I said. "The $4 million was just a band-aid. The interest rates on this illegal loan are predatory. The bank is demanding payment, and Marcus is completely out of cash. That is why they wanted to throw you in a state-run nursing home. They needed you out of the house so they could figure out how to sell the property quickly and quietly before the bank seized it and the fraud was exposed." The depth of my father's depravity was breathtaking. He was willing to discard his own father into a squalid facility and leave his daughter to handle the mess just so he could escape the consequences of his own theft. They were currently sitting in Paris drinking champagne bought with stolen money, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire financial life was laid bare on my dining room table. I was about to explain the federal prison time Marcus was facing when a sharp, obtrusive ringing shattered the silence of the room. My phone was vibrating violently against the oak table. The screen lit up with an incoming FaceTime call. I looked at the caller identification. It was Chloe. I answered the call and the screen instantly filled with the blinding white lights of a high-end designer boutique. Chloe stood in the center of the frame wearing oversized sunglasses indoors and a smug pout. Behind her, the unmistakable arches of Paris were visible through the glass storefront. She shoved a massive white leather handbag toward the camera. The gold hardware caught the boutique lights. $25,000, Nia. Chloe practically squealed. Limited edition. But my stupid travel card just declined. The fraud alert must have tripped because I have been swiping it all over the Avenue Montaigne all morning. Chloe sighed loudly, adjusting her sunglasses. "Anyway, I need you to do something useful for once. Go into your dad's study. Open the top right drawer of his desk. There is a solid black American Express card in there. Read the numbers to me right now so I can give them to the sales associate." I stared at the screen. My sister-in-law was demanding I act as her personal financial secretary to fund a handbag that cost more than my first car. I looked up at Silas. He remained perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of cold calculation. "Nia, hello," Chloe snapped, snapping her manicured fingers at the camera. "Are you frozen? Move. The sales associate is looking at me like I'm some kind of peasant. I cannot be embarrassed in front of these Parisians. Jamal is at a cafe down the street, and I am not walking over there in this freezing rain to get his wallet. Go get the card." Before I could formulate a response, the camera jerked wildly. My mother Vivian shoved her way into the frame. She was wearing a thick fur coat that I knew for a fact Marcus had bought her just last week. Her face was flushed with irritation. "Do what your sister-in-law says. Right this second, Nia." My mother barked, her voice echoing loudly enough to make the French sales associates in the background turn and stare. "Stop dragging your feet. We are on a luxury vacation, and we do not have time for your sluggish attitude. Find the card and pay the balance." "You want me to blindly read off a credit card number so Chloe can buy a purse while Grandpa sits here in a freezing house?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Do not use that tone with me," Vivian sneered. "We left you perfectly clear instructions. You are eating our food and sleeping under our roof. The least you can do is make yourself useful. Do not be a useless burden. And while I have you on the phone, you had better make sure the old man has all his belongings boxed up in trash bags by Friday. The transport van for St. Jude's will be there at 8 in the morning. Have him sitting on the porch." The sheer callousness of her words took my breath away. She was talking about her own father-in-law, the man whose house she was currently treating as her personal piggy bank. She wanted me to stuff his entire life into garbage bags and leave him on the freezing porch like discarded mail. I looked at Silas. He nodded once. It was a silent command to push back. "I am not packing his bags," I said softly, "and I am not giving you any credit card numbers." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Then my mother's face contorted with a rage so intense it distorted the video feed. "Excuse me," she practically screamed. "You ungrateful little brat! How dare you speak to me that way? You are a failure, Nia. You have always been a failure. The second our flight lands in Atlanta, you are out on the street. I will personally throw your cheap clothes onto the driveway. You will have nothing." "Enjoy Paris, Mom," I said. I pressed the red button and ended the call, tossing the phone back onto the dining table. The sudden silence in the study was a sharp contrast to my mother's screeching voice. I took a deep breath, letting the reality of what just happened wash over me. My mother had just threatened to render me homeless because I refused to facilitate my sister-in-law's shopping spree. I turned my attention back to my father's heavy mahogany desk. Chloe had been very specific. Top right drawer. I walked over and pulled the brass handle. The drawer slid open smoothly. Inside, resting neatly in a small leather tray, was the solid black American Express card Chloe had demanded. I picked it up. The metal felt heavy and cold in my palm. I flipped it over to read the front, expecting to see my father's name, or perhaps the name of the family logistics company. Instead, I stared at the embossed silver lettering. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I turned around and held the card up so Silas could see it. "Grandpa?" I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "This card is not in Marcus's name. It is in yours." Silas wheeled his chair closer and looked at the black metal card. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what this meant. This was not just a case of an entitled sister-in-law spending too much money. Marcus and Jamal had opened a line of limitless credit entirely under my grandfather's identity. I walked back to my laptop and pulled up the credit inquiry databases I used for corporate liquidations. It only took me 3 minutes to bypass the basic security protocols and access the account history for the black card. The screen filled with lines of extravagant charges. First-class flights to Europe, 5-star hotel suites, Michelin-starred dinners. All of it was being billed to a man who was sitting in a dark house with no heat. The absolute audacity was staggering. They had weaponized his supposed dementia, turning his identity into a blank check for their own greed. They were treating him like a corpse they could loot while he was still breathing. I looked over at Silas. He was watching my screen, his expression hardened into pure granite. Every designer bag, every luxury dinner, every first-class ticket to Paris was being charged directly to a man they had legally declared incompetent. They are actively committing federal elder financial abuse. I stared at the black card in my hand, letting the reality of my family's crimes sink in. Silas reached into the breast pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a small encrypted silver flash drive. He placed it on the oak table next to my laptop. The metal clinked sharply against the wood. "That contains the master access keys to the logistics company mainframe," Silas said, his voice stripped of all emotion. Marcus changed all the administrative passwords when he took over, but he forgot that I built the entire IT infrastructure from the ground up. I left a backdoor open. I plugged the drive into my machine and ran the decryption sequence. A black terminal window popped up. I typed in the override commands, and within seconds I was staring at the raw, unfiltered financial database of our family empire. As a forensic accountant, I have dismantled billion-dollar corporations and sent corrupt executives to federal prison. I know exactly how thieves try to hide their tracks. I bypassed the glossy quarterly reports Marcus had prepared for the board and dug straight into the raw general ledgers. The rot was deeper than I ever could have imagined. I started with the payroll. I cross-referenced the active employee roster against the federal tax filings. Instantly, I found 20 ghost employees. They had generic names and standard salaries, but their direct deposits were all routing to a single holding company registered in Delaware. I tracked that holding company to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Marcus had not just made a few bad business deals, he was running a massive shadow payroll. He was systematically bleeding the logistics company dry to maintain his country club lifestyle. I pulled up the expense reports and matched them to the offshore transfers. The dates aligned perfectly. When Marcus bought Vivian a new Bentley, the offshore account transferred the exact amount. When Chloe demanded a luxury dog spa for her golden retrievers, another $50,000 was funneled through a phantom logistics consultant. My father was not a business genius. He was a common thief operating with the arrogance of a man who believed he would never be caught. He thought because I was quiet and compliant that I was stupid. He thought my career in corporate liquidation was just fixing spreadsheets. He had no idea that I spent my days hunting people exactly like him. Suddenly, my phone buzzed violently on the table. A text message flashed across the screen. It was from Marcus. The corporate firewall must have sent an automated alert to his phone in Paris, notifying him that the master servers were being probed. I opened the message. "Stop touching my computers, Nia," it read. "You fix spreadsheets for a living, so do not pretend you understand real business. You are triggering the security alarms. Get off the network right now. Do what your mother told you and pack Silas's bags. If you do not have him ready for the transport van by Friday morning, I will personally call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing on my property." I read the text message out loud to Silas. The sheer audacity of the threat hung in the freezing air of the study. My father was threatening to have me arrested for trespassing in a house he did not even own, while he was actively stealing millions of dollars from the man sitting right across from me. "Your property," Silas repeated softly. He leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes glittering with a dangerous light. "The boy has lost his mind. He has stolen my money, and now he believes he owns my kingdom. Find the mortgage documents, Nia. Find exactly how he tied this house to his sinking ship." I turned my attention back to the encrypted database. I bypassed the corporate accounts and searched for the personal estate files. Marcus was incredibly sloppy. He kept scanned copies of his illegal transactions in a poorly secured subfolder labeled Estate Planning. I found the loan origination document for the $4 million commercial line of credit. I opened the heavy digital PDF and scrolled past pages of predatory interest rates and harsh repayment terms. The bank had secured the loan entirely against the equity of the ancestral estate. If the loan defaulted, the bank had the absolute right to seize the property and auction it off to the highest bidder. Marcus had gambled 30 years of Silas's blood and sweat to cover up his own corporate embezzlement. I scrolled down to the final page to look at the authorization signatures. There it was in dark blue ink, my grandfather's sprawling, distinctive signature signing away the rights to his own home. I zoomed in on the document, checking the timestamp of the notary seal. The date printed next to the signature was October 14th, exactly 3 months ago. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked up at Silas. My hands were trembling, but my voice was completely steady. "Grandpa?" I said, turning the laptop so he could see the screen. "Look at the date on this deed transfer." Silas leaned forward and studied the blue ink. "October 14th, he murmured. 3 months ago, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. 3 months ago, you were in the intensive care unit at Atlanta General Hospital. You had suffered a severe respiratory infection. You were completely incapacitated on a ventilator. You could not speak, let alone hold a pen to sign a multi-million-dollar commercial loan agreement. Silas stared at the forged signature, his jaw set in a rigid line. He did not say a word, but the fury radiating from him was palpable. Marcus did not just embezzle from the company, I continued, the full weight of the crime settling over me. He committed blatant, undeniable forgery. He falsified a legal document to secure a fraudulent loan across state lines. This is not just a family dispute anymore. This is a massive federal felony. They are actively committing wire fraud, bank fraud, and elder financial abuse. If the federal authorities see this document, Marcus will spend the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. And that is exactly where he belongs, Silas said, his voice colder than the winter storm raging outside. Print it out, Nia. Print every single page. I hit the print command, and the heavy laser printer in the corner of the study hummed to life, churning out the evidence of my father's destruction. My family had spent my entire life treating me like a useless burden. They had belittled my career and mocked my independence. They thought they could discard Silas like trash and leave me behind to clean up their mess. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had left the family scapegoat alone in the house with all the evidence, and the very man they had tried to bury was sitting right beside me, ready to burn their stolen empire to the ground. The printer fell silent, leaving a stack of damning evidence on the oak table. Silas reached out and aligned the edges of the warm paper perfectly. His face was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw told me everything. Marcus was going to burn for the forgery, but a massive piece of the puzzle was still missing. Marcus was arrogant, but he was not smart enough to build an offshore money laundering network on his own. He lacked the technical discipline. Someone else had to be moving the cash. I turned my attention back to the encrypted server logs. I needed to see exactly where the money went after it hit the Cayman Islands. I traced the outgoing wire transfers from the offshore holding company. The funds did not sit in the Caribbean. They were being bounced back on shore into a domestic corporate account. I ran a search on the routing numbers and pulled the state registry filings. The receiving account belonged to a domestic limited liability company named Apex Global Consulting. I accessed the corporate registry database to find the listed officers. I stared at the name on the screen, and a cold laugh escaped my throat. The sole proprietor and registered agent for Apex Global Consulting was Jamal. My older brother was not just a failed entrepreneur coasting on my parents' money. He was the bagman. I opened the billing ledgers for Apex Global and cross-referenced them with the logistics company accounts. The scheme was breathtakingly simple but effective. Jamal was generating dozens of fake invoices every month. He was billing the family business for fleet efficiency analysis, market trend reports, and strategic consulting. Marcus would sign off on the fraudulent invoices as legitimate corporate expenses. The company money would flow to Jamal. He would wash it through his consulting firm, take a massive cut to fund his luxury cars and designer clothes, and funnel the rest back to Marcus. I turned the laptop so Silas could see the fraudulent invoices. $50,000 for a logistics efficiency report, I said, pointing at the screen. Jamal failed basic algebra twice in high school. He has never worked a day in logistics. Yet Marcus approved a $50,000 payout for a report that does not exist. Jamal is not just an entitled idiot grandpa. He is a co-conspirator. He is actively laundering the money his father steals. Silas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at the name of his only grandson on the fraudulent corporate filings. For my entire life, Jamal had been the golden child. He could do no wrong. My parents had treated him like royalty, while treating me like the hired help. Now the truth was laid bare. The golden boy was nothing but a common criminal, helping his father dismantle the empire Silas had spent a lifetime building. "They really thought they were smarter than me," Silas said, his voice carrying a dangerous, deadly calm. "They thought they could strip the copper out of the walls while I was sitting in the same room. Add Jamal to the federal file, Nia. We are going to hand the authorities a neatly wrapped conspiracy case." Before I could press another key, my cell phone chimed loudly against the wood table. I glanced at the screen. It was a text message from Jamal. I opened the message and my blood boiled. It was a photograph of Jamal sitting at an outdoor table at an exclusive Parisian cafe. He was wearing a custom-tailored coat and holding up a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon. The Eiffel Tower was visible in the background. His smile was wide, smug, and utterly punchable. I read the text message attached to the photo out loud so Silas could hear it. Hope you are enjoying the nursing home brochures, sis. Keep the house warm for us. Big things coming when we get back. The sheer hubris of the message was sickening. He was sitting in Europe drinking $1,000 champagne paid for by his grandfather's stolen money and taunting the sister he had left behind to do his dirty work. He actually believed he had won. He believed that by Friday Silas would be locked away in a miserable state facility and the estate would be entirely theirs to control. They had planned this vacation not just as a luxury getaway, but as an alibi. They wanted to be out of the country when the dirty work was done, so they could return with clean hands. I was about to type a response when a heavy thud echoed through the silent house. It was a sharp, aggressive knock on the mahogany front door. Silas and I exchanged a quick look. It was Christmas Eve. The estate was locked behind massive iron gates that my parents had deliberately left open. We were not expecting anyone. I stood up from the dining table and walked down the long hallway to the grand foyer. The air near the entrance was freezing. The sleet was hitting the tall glass windows beside the door with a sharp clicking sound. I looked through the peephole. Standing on the frozen porch was a courier wearing a thick winter jacket holding an oversized rigid cardboard envelope. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. The bitter wind immediately rushed into the foyer. Nia Wilson, the courier, asked, shivering as he held out an electronic signature pad. "That is me," I said. I signed the screen with a digital stylus and took the heavy package. The courier turned and hurried back to his waiting delivery truck, desperate to escape the freezing rain. I closed the door and locked the deadbolt. I carried the rigid envelope back into the dining room. Silas watched me closely as I sat back down at the table. The return address, printed in bold black ink, belonged to Vanguard Holdings, a massive commercial real estate conglomerate known for purchasing large estates and bulldozing them to build luxury subdivisions. The package was heavily sealed with red tamper-evident tape. I grabbed a silver letter opener from Silas's desk and sliced through the thick cardboard. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. The cover page was printed in large, bold letters. It was a formal notice of intent to purchase. I scanned the first page, and everything suddenly made terrifying sense. The $4 million illegal loan was just the beginning. Marcus and Jamal had not just drained the equity out of the house. They had entered into a binding contract to sell the entire ancestral estate to Vanguard Holdings for $12 million. The closing date was scheduled for the first week of January. That was the big thing Jamal was bragging about in his text message. They needed Silas locked away in a state facility immediately because the real estate developers were coming to take possession of the land. I pulled the thick stack of documents from the heavy cardboard envelope. The first few pages were standard legal boilerplate, but beneath them lay a massive fold-out sheet of architectural blueprints. I spread the large blue paper across the dining room table, smoothing the curled edges flat. My breath caught in my throat. Silas leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the white lines printed across the blue grid. Vanguard Holdings was not just buying the property. They had already drafted comprehensive plans to completely demolish the ancestral estate. The blueprints showed my grandfather us historic home leveled to the ground. The sprawling gardens he had planted by hand for my late grandmother 30 years ago were marked to be paved over and converted into a massive concrete parking garage. The western wing, where I had grown up, was slated to become a commercial loading dock. The destruction was meticulously planned. The destruction was absolute. I flipped back to this main contract, reading the financial terms with a growing sense of absolute disgust. The structure of the deal was a masterclass in predatory liquidation. Marcus and Jamal had not just forged a signature to cover a few missing funds. They had arranged a rapid-fire distress sale. They were selling the entire estate to Vanguard for a fraction of its actual market value. The contract explicitly outlined that after the illegal corporate debts were settled, the remaining $4 million in cash would be wired directly into Jamal U.S. Offshore Shell Company. I traced the routing numbers printed on the final page of the contract. The money was not going into a family trust. The money was not going into a corporate safety net. The $4 million in pure cash was scheduled to drop directly into the Cayman Islands account that Jamal controlled. They were not planning to come back from Paris and manage a transition. They were planning to take the $4 million in pure cash and vanish. They were going to leave Silas to rot in a state-run nursing home while Vanguard bulldozers rolled onto the property to tear down everything he had ever built. My father and my brother were cowards. They had orchestrated a total extraction of wealth, and they intended to flee like thieves in the night, leaving me to face the federal auditors and the demolition crews. As I stared at the forged signature on the final page of the contract, my laptop screen lit up with a bright notification banner. An email had just arrived in my personal inbox. I clicked the icon. The sender was Chloe. I opened the message. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained a single paragraph typed out with the casual cruelty that only my sister-in-law possessed. It read, "Hey babe, just so you know, my interior designer needs your bedroom cleared out by Monday. We are turning it into a wellness spa for my golden retrievers. They need a dedicated hydrotherapy space. Hope you can find a cheap apartment. We will be back soon, so make sure you have the old man out of the house by Friday." I stared at the glowing screen. My chest tightened with a rage so profound, it felt like ice water flooding my veins. Chloe was sitting in a luxury boutique on the Champs-Élysées, waving a $25,000 handbag, and she still found the time to send an email solely designed to humiliate me. She wanted to remind me of my place. She wanted to make sure I knew that in the hierarchy of our family, her dogs were entitled to a hydrotherapy spa, while I was expected to scramble for a cheap apartment on the street. She was measuring drapes for a house her husband had already sold to a demolition crew. Her ignorance was just as staggering as her arrogance. "What is it?" Nia Silas asked, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. He watched my face closely, his dark eyes analyzing my reaction. I turned the laptop screen toward him so he could read the email. He read Chloe's words, and a slow, dark shadow passed over his face. He looked from the digital screen to the physical blueprints of the demolition scattered across his dining table. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was staggering. They were mocking us while actively dismantling our lives. They thought they held all the power. They thought we were completely ignorant of the trap they had set. They thought we were victims waiting for the slaughter. I placed my hands on the keyboard. I did not type an emotional response. I did not beg for my home. I did not threaten them with federal prison. As a corporate liquidator, I knew that the absolute worst thing you can do to an arrogant opponent is interrupt them while they are making a fatal mistake. You let them build their own gallows. You let them tie their own noose. You let them tighten the knot. I hit reply. I typed a single word. Agreed. I hit send and watched the message fly across the Atlantic Ocean directly to Chloe's phone. Silas leaned back in his heavy oak chair, his brow furrowing in confusion. He looked at me, his sharp gaze demanding an explanation. "Why on earth did you agree to that, Nia?" he asked, his voice low and rumbling with warning. I closed the laptop with a sharp snap. I looked at my grandfather and smiled coldly. Because, Grandpa, the moment they believe they have completely won is the exact moment they stop looking over their shoulders. We are going to let them think they have secured the $4 million. We are going to let them celebrate in Paris. And when they finally walk back through those front doors, expecting to find an empty house and a cleared-out bank account, they are going to find me holding the matches to their entire empire. I stared at the bold red logo of Vanguard Restructuring printed at the top of the heavy legal packet. The freezing sleet continued to batter the tall windows of the study, but the coldness inside the room had nothing to do with the weather. Marcus and Jamal had expedited the sale through a shadow broker, hoping to push the paperwork through before the new year. They were selling the legacy of our family for untraceable cash. I slid the contract across the oak table toward Silas. He picked up his reading glasses and scanned the terms. His eyes darkened as he read the names of the signing executives representing the buyer. He flipped past the architectural blueprints that showed his life's work being bulldozed into a parking lot. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He pointed a steady finger to the bottom of the final page. Nia, Silas said, his voice steady, but laced with utter bewilderment. This purchasing agent. It says the acquisition is being managed by the senior partner of Vanguard Restructuring. The signature line requires the final authorization of an N. Wilson. I leaned back in my chair and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I reached into my leather bag sitting on the floor and pulled out my heavy brass business card holder. I slid a sleek matte black card across the smooth wood of the table. It landed right next to the fraudulent deed. Silas picked it up. Engraved in crisp silver lettering was my name. Nia Wilson, Senior Partner, Vanguard Restructuring. My father always told his country club friends that I was a glorified accountant. I said, the deep satisfaction of the truth finally washing over me. He told everyone that I fixed spreadsheets for failing businesses. He never bothered to actually learn what corporate liquidation means. Vanguard Restructuring is my division, Grandpa. I built it from the ground up. I manage a $2 billion commercial real estate acquisition portfolio. When distressed assets are flagged for rapid liquidation, they cross my desk for final approval. The absolute absurdity of their plan hung heavily in the air. Marcus and Jamal had hired a shady offshore broker to quietly sell the estate to a massive private equity firm, completely unaware that the firm they chose was run by the very daughter they had left behind to pack Silas's bags. They had unknowingly delivered the physical evidence of their own felony directly into my hands. Silas let out a sound that was half laugh and half growl. "They forged my signature to sell my house to your company," he said, the reality of their staggering stupidity settling in. "They literally handed you the murder weapon." "It is better than that," I explained, pulling the laptop closer to me. "Right now, they are guilty of forgery and corporate embezzlement. Those are state-level crimes. With their expensive lawyers and Marcus's connections, they might be able to drag those charges out in local courts for years. But this real estate contract changes the entire landscape." I pointed to the wire transfer instructions on the final page of the Vanguard contract. "They are demanding the $4 million cash payout be wired directly to Jamal's Cayman Islands account upon closing. If we stop the sale right now, it is just an attempted fraud. But if we authorize the transaction, if we let Vanguard send that wire, and they accept the stolen funds, it becomes a completed act of massive federal wire fraud. It crosses international borders. It triggers immediate federal jurisdiction. Once that money hits the offshore account, the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission will have absolute authority to step in." I continued, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. "They will freeze every single asset Marcus and Jamal possess worldwide. They will not just lose the money and the cars. They will face 20 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole." Silas sat in total silence, absorbing the lethal beauty of the strategy. For months, Marcus had treated him like a decaying burden, slowly poisoning him with stress and isolation, plotting to dump him in a state-run medical facility while stealing his life's work. My father and brother had laughed at me, belittled my career, and treated me like an obedient servant. Now the power dynamic had violently and permanently shifted. We did not just have a solid legal defense, we had a perfectly constructed guillotine, and Marcus had positioned his own neck right on the block. Silas stood up from the table. The slight tremor in his hands was completely gone. The exhaustion that had clouded his face for the past 3 months vanished, replaced by the sharp, calculating energy of the ruthless businessman who had built a logistics empire from the dirt. He did not say a single word as he turned and walked out of the study, leaving me alone with the forged paperwork and the glowing laptop screen. I waited, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak door swung open. I looked up and my breath caught in my throat. Silas had shed the oversized cardigan and the baggy sweatpants that Marcus had forced him to wear like a uniform of defeat. He strode back into the room wearing a charcoal gray custom-tailored suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. His silver hair was perfectly combed back. The posture of a dying man was gone. He looked exactly like the corporate titan he truly was. He walked to the head of the dining table and placed his hands flat on the polished wood, his dark eyes burning with absolute unyielding authority. "Authorize the wire transfer, Nia," Silas said, his voice ringing with raw power. "Let them take the bait. Then call my real lawyers. It is time to go to war." I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had memorized years ago. The call connected on the first ring. It was Arthur Vance. He was the senior partner at the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the city, and he was the man who originally built the legal foundation of Silas's empire. Marcus thought he had fired Arthur 3 years ago when he took over operations, but Silas had quietly kept him on retainer. Arthur did not ask questions. I gave him the address, told him the situation was critical, and hung up. Less than an hour later, a sleek black town car pulled through the open iron gates of the estate, its headlights cutting through the freezing sleet. Arthur stepped out of the vehicle, followed by 2 junior associates and a man carrying a black leather medical bag. We moved them into the study quickly and quietly, locking the heavy oak doors behind us. The man with the medical bag was Dr. Eris Thorne, a board-certified neurologist. Marcus had been telling the country club circuit and the board of directors that Silas was suffering from severe advanced dementia to justify taking total control of the assets. We needed bulletproof medical evidence to destroy that lie. Dr. Thorne sat across from Silas and began a rigorous cognitive assessment. I watched my grandfather answer every question with razor-sharp precision. He recited corporate account numbers from memory, detailed the exact architectural history of the estate, and calmly explained the precise mechanism of the offshore money laundering network Marcus had built. Dr. Thorne did not just declare him competent. He signed a certified sworn affidavit stating that Silas was in the top percentile of cognitive function for his age group and possessed absolute 100% mental clarity. The medical document was stamped and notarized on the spot by one of Arthur's associates. The false narrative of the senile old man was officially dead. Arthur spread a thick stack of fresh legal documents across the dining table right next to the fraudulent Vanguard blueprints. The first document was the most important. It was a total immediate revocation of the power of attorney. Marcus had used a general power of attorney to sign the corporate loans and approve the shadow payroll. Silas picked up a gold fountain pen and signed his name with aggressive, forceful strokes. Arthur notarized the signature immediately. From this exact second onward, Marcus had zero legal authority to act on behalf of Silas or the logistics company. Every single financial move Marcus made from this moment forward was no longer just an ethical violation. It was a documented, verifiable criminal act. He was officially operating without a net. But Silas was not finished. He pushed the revocation aside and pulled the next stack of documents forward. "I am not leaving anything to chance, Nia," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet study. "Marcus will try to freeze the accounts the moment he realizes he is locked out. We are moving the entire board to a new playing field." Arthur had drafted the paperwork to establish a new, irrevocable blind trust. Silas transferred his entire remaining fortune, his personal bank accounts, his voting shares in the logistics empire, and the legitimate deeds to all his commercial properties directly into the trust. He stripped Marcus of any potential future claim. Then Silas signed the final page naming the sole trustee who would maintain absolute control over every single asset. He named me. I was no longer just the daughter who fixed spreadsheets. I was the absolute controller of a logistics empire. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sharp buzzing of my cell phone on the table. Arthur paused his paperwork. I looked down at the screen. It was another text message from Jamal. The notification banner glowed brightly against the dark wood of the table. I opened the message. "Hey," the title company called, Jamal wrote. "They are processing the final clearance for the buyer, but they need you to scan a copy of Grandpa's ID to verify the escrow routing." The closing agent is getting impatient. Stop whatever you are doing and send it right now. Do not mess this up, Nia. The sheer arrogance of his demand was almost laughable. He was sitting in Paris barking orders at me to facilitate the theft of the very house I was standing in. He wanted me to hand him the final piece of the puzzle so he could collect his $4 million and disappear into the wind. Arthur looked at the message over my shoulder and frowned. If you send him that identification, they will finalize the wire transfer, he warned quietly. They will move the money offshore within seconds. I know, I said, picking up my phone. That is exactly what we want them to do. I walked over to Silas's desk and opened the top drawer. I found his passport and his state identification card. I placed them flat on the leather desk pad and snapped a high-resolution photograph with my phone. I walked back to the table and showed the image to Silas. He gave me a single firm nod. I did not reply to Jamal. I did not send him the photograph. Instead, I opened my secure Vanguard restructuring work portal on my laptop. I drafted a priority internal email directly to my lead compliance officer at Vanguard headquarters. I attached the photograph of Silas's identification. I authorized the immediate release of the $4 million acquisition funds, but I did not clear them to bounce through the offshore holding company. I instructed my compliance team to route the massive wire transfer into a highly monitored federal escrow account, flagged specifically for international money laundering investigations. Jamal thought he was ordering his subservient sister to fetch his payout. He had no idea he had just commanded the senior partner of Vanguard to lock the vault door, completely shutting him and his father inside a federal trap they could never escape. Arthur Vance stepped back as Silas signed the final authorization, granting me full executive control over the newly established blind trust. I did not waste a single second. I opened my laptop and initiated a secure conference call with the executive fraud divisions at American Express Chase and the primary family banking institution. Because Silas was sitting right beside me providing verbal confirmation, and Arthur was present to verify the legal transfer of power, the banks moved with immediate ruthless efficiency. I started with the black cards. I read the account numbers belonging to Marcus and Jamal directly to the American Express fraud agent. I informed them that the cards were currently being used in an active international elder financial abuse scheme and requested an immediate hard freeze on all associated lines of credit. The agent did not hesitate. Within 40 seconds, every American Express card tied to my father and my brother was permanently deactivated. I moved on to the Chase accounts, freezing their personal checking and savings lines, citing suspected money laundering and identity theft. Finally, I contacted the private family bank. I submitted the signed revocation of the power of attorney and the new trust documents directly to their secure portal. The bank compliance officer immediately locked the corporate accounts, the shadow payroll conduits, and the offshore transfer mechanisms. I watched the status indicators on my dual monitors turn from active green to a dead frozen red. Marcus and Jamal were completely cut off. They had no access to the logistics company funds, no access to their personal savings, and no ability to draw credit. I had just severed the financial artery of their entire European vacation. Thousands of miles away, the illusion of their stolen wealth was about to shatter in the most spectacular way possible. It was Christmas evening in Paris. I could easily picture the scene based on the obnoxious social media posts Chloe had been uploading all week. Marcus, Vivian, Jamal, and Chloe were seated at a premier table inside a Michelin-starred restaurant overlooking the Seine River. They had undoubtedly spent the last 3 hours indulging in a grotesque display of gluttony. They would have ordered beluga caviar, white truffles, and multiple bottles of Grand Cru Burgundy wine. They were celebrating the imminent sale of the ancestral estate and the $4 million payday they believed was safely in the pipeline. The waiter approached their table carrying a silver tray. He presented the leather-bound check holder to Marcus. The bill for their celebratory Christmas dinner was exactly $3,000. Marcus would not have even glanced at the itemized receipt. He would have simply reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his heavy metal corporate credit card, and dropped it onto the silver tray with a smug, dismissive wave. The waiter bowed and walked away to process the payment. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. He did not have a pen for Marcus to sign. Instead, he leaned down and whispered discreetly that the card had been declined. Marcus would have scoffed, blaming a security hold for international travel. He would have pulled out a second card, then a third. Every single piece of plastic he handed over would return with the exact same fatal error code. The murmurs at their table would have turned into panicked hisses. Vivian would have frantically dug through her designer purse, looking for a backup card. Jamal would have tried to run the corporate card for his fake consulting firm, only to find that Apex Global was just as frozen as the rest of them. Chloe would have tried her own accounts, only to discover that her access to the family wealth had been revoked. The waiter would have stopped whispering and demanded an alternative form of payment. The maitre d' would have been summoned. The other wealthy patrons in the restaurant would have started to stare as the loud, arrogant American family suddenly found themselves unable to pay for their lavish meal. Back in the study, I closed my laptop and let out a long breath. Arthur and his team packed up their briefcases, having secured the estate and all the necessary legal filings. They quietly exited the house, leaving Silas and me alone in the study. Silas walked over to the fireplace and tossed another log onto the glowing embers. The winter storm outside was howling, but inside the house it was warm and remarkably peaceful. I walked over to the kitchen, poured myself a mug of hot cocoa, and stood by the crackling fire, letting the heat soak into my bones. My cell phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. The caller ID flashed Marcus Paris Mobile. I let it ring 3 times, listening to the steady chime before sliding my thumb across the screen to answer. Nia Marcus hissed, his voice a harsh, frantic whisper. The background noise sounded like a busy Parisian street, meaning he had been forced to step outside the restaurant to hide his humiliation from the other diners. The cards are declining. Every single one of them is coming back dead. Did you touch the mail in my office? Did you miss a payment on the corporate accounts? We are sitting in a restaurant with a $3,000 bill and the manager is threatening to call the local police. Fix this right now. Call the bank and verify the travel alert. Do your job and get these cards turned back on. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot cocoa. The rich chocolate was a stark contrast to the absolute ice in my voice. I looked at Silas, who was watching me from his leather chair, a small, proud smile playing on his lips. I did not touch anything, Dad, I said, staring at the roaring fire. The bank said the accounts are permanently frozen due to an active federal investigation into suspected elder fraud and international money laundering. I cannot help you. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red end call button, cutting off his panicked response mid-sentence. The screen of my phone went completely black for exactly 2 seconds before it lit up again. This time, the caller ID flashed with Chloe's name. I swiped to accept the call and put it on speaker, setting the phone flat on the polished oak table so Silas could hear every word. Chloe did not say hello. The soft, breathy voice she used for her million online followers was completely gone. In its place was a screeching, hysterical shriek. "You useless idiot!" Chloe screamed, the audio clipping from the sheer volume of her voice. I could hear the distinct sound of shattering glass in the background, followed by a string of rapid, angry French. They were definitely making a scene. We are trapped in a restaurant surrounded by security guards. Jamal is arguing with the manager and your father is hyperventilating. Wire us money right now. Log into your pathetic little savings account and wire $10,000 to my emergency app so we can pay this bill and get out of here. I looked at Silas. He picked up his teacup, taking a slow sip. He did not look angry anymore. He just looked deeply, terribly bored by their existence. "I am sorry, Chloe," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "My pathetic savings account does not cover international bailouts for attempted corporate theft. Maybe you can pay the bill with exposure. I hear your followers love a good authentic crisis." I ended the call. The phone immediately began to vibrate again. This time it was my mother. Vivian was the ultimate enabler, the woman who had spent 30 years looking the other way, while Marcus stripped Silas of his power, and Jamal treated me like an obedient servant. I did not answer. I watched the screen ring out until a voicemail notification popped up. I tapped the icon and hit play. Vivian's voice filled the quiet study. There was no panic in her tone, just a cold, absolute venom that she had always reserved entirely for me. "You are dead to me." "Nia." Vivian snarled the words, dripping with a toxic disgust I had never fully heard directed at me until this exact moment. "I do not know what kind of technical glitch you caused to embarrass your father this way, but you have ruined our Christmas. We are flying back early. Pack your trash. You are out on the street the second I see your face. If you are still in that house when we walk through the front doors, I will have you forcibly removed by the police." The message clicked off. The silence in the study felt heavy. For 30 seconds I sat there processing the reality that my own mother had just disowned me over a frozen credit card. I waited for the familiar sting of rejection, the childhood ache of never being good enough for her. It never came. Instead, a massive, suffocating weight lifted off my chest. She had finally said it out loud. The superficial bond was broken, and I was completely free. "I am calling the security firm," Silas said, his voice breaking the silence. He reached for the antique brass telephone on his desk. "If they are flying back early, we have less than 14 hours to lock down the perimeter." "No, Grandpa," I said, sliding my phone back into my pocket. "You rest. I am handling this." I pulled out my laptop and searched for the top private security contractor in the state. I did not call the local locksmith or the neighborhood patrol. I contacted a high-threat asset protection firm that normally handled celebrity details and corporate lockdowns. Because the Vanguard acquisition accounts were fully operational, I paid their exorbitant emergency retainer without blinking. Within 2 hours, 3 unmarked black vans pulled through the main gates of the estate. 12 men in tactical gear stepped out, carrying heavy equipment cases. I met their captain on the front steps and gave him my orders. They moved through the property with military precision. They ripped out every single deadbolt on the exterior doors and replaced them with high-security biometric locks. They disconnected the digital gate mechanism and wiped all existing access codes from the mainframe, erasing Marcus, Jamal, and Vivian from the system permanently. They did not stop there. The captain assigned 2 armed guards to the main iron gates and posted another 2 at the front entrance of the main house. The ancestral estate was no longer just a home. It was an impenetrable fortress, and I held the only key. Silas watched from the large bay window of the living room, his hands clasped behind his back. He watched the heavy iron gates swing shut, locking with a loud, definitive metallic clang. The reign of Marcus and Jamal was over. They had been physically and digitally erased from the property. I walked back into the study and sat down at the table. The fire was burning low, casting long dancing shadows against the walls. My Vanguard Company tablet, resting near my coffee mug, suddenly emitted a sharp, double chime. I pulled the screen toward me. It was an automated alert from the compliance division at Vanguard Restructuring. The interface glowed with a bright green confirmation banner. The $4 million wire transfer for the purchase of the estate had been fully processed and released from the federal escrow account. I clicked on the transaction details, tracing the digital footprint of the money. The funds had successfully crossed international borders. They had bypassed the standard holding queues and landed exactly where they were instructed to go. The $4 million had successfully deposited into Marcus's offshore corporate account in the Cayman Islands. But because I had triggered the global fraud freeze hours earlier, that offshore account was entirely locked down. Marcus could not withdraw a single cent. He could not route it back. He could not delete the transaction history. The stolen money was sitting in an account that Marcus exclusively controlled, and the receipt of those funds officially verified the crime. The trap had slammed completely shut. The federal crime of massive international wire fraud was officially complete. In the lobby of the Plaza Athénée, the reality of their situation was actively dismantling Chloe's perfectly curated universe. For her entire life, Chloe had relied on the absolute protection of her father's generational wealth. She was untouchable. She was untouchable when she wrecked her first car. She was untouchable when she dropped out of 3 different private universities. She was untouchable when she married Jamal, believing he was the heir to a logistics empire. She stood near the marble pillars of the hotel lobby, gripping her phone and screaming at her father's private wealth manager in New York. She demanded he bypass the freeze. She demanded he clear the holds. She demanded he use his connections to force American Express to authorize the $3,000 dinner bill. The banker's response was a swift and brutal reality check. He explained with absolute clinical detachment that her husband and father-in-law had triggered a federal hold. He told her the words, elder financial abuse and international money laundering. He told her that no amount of old money, no amount of favors, and no amount of screaming could override a federal fraud investigation. He advised her to retain criminal defense counsel immediately, and then he hung up. Chloe dropped her phone into her designer bag and turned to Jamal. The sweet, breathless influencer persona vanished instantly. The mask was gone. The facade was gone. The illusion was completely gone. "You are a broke fraud!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the luxury lobby. "You told me you owned that company. You told me the $4 million was a guaranteed payout. I am stranded in Paris because my husband is a common thief. You are nothing but a cheap con artist playing dress-up with your grandfather's money." Jamal flinched violently, looking around the lobby as other wealthy guests stopped to stare. He tried to grab her arm to quiet her down, but she slapped his hand away with absolute disgust. "Do not touch me," Chloe spat, backing away from him. "You fix this, or I am calling my father to send a private jet just for me. You can rot in a French prison." Marcus stepped between them, his face a deep shade of crimson. He pointed a trembling finger at his son. "This was your offshore broker, Jamal." Marcus hissed, his voice shaking with a potent mix of fear and fury. "You swore the Cayman account was untraceable. You swore Vanguard would process the deed without triggering a compliance review. You rushed the paperwork, and you triggered a federal audit." "I rushed the paperwork," Jamal shot back, stepping into his father's personal space. "You are the one who forged a dead man's signature while he was still breathing upstairs. You are the one who drained the corporate accounts to cover your bad bets. Do not put this on me. You built the trap and you walked us right into it." They stood in the center of the opulent lobby, tearing each other apart. The father blamed the son blamed the father. The loyalty they had sworn to each other evaporated the exact second the money disappeared. They were cowards turning on each other to save themselves. Back in Atlanta, the tactical security team finished their sweep of the estate. The heavy steel barricades were locked into place. The biometric scanners glowed with a quiet, steady green light. The estate was fully secured. It was secure against thieves. It was secure against trespassers. It was secure against my own family. I stood on the front porch watching the rain turn to heavy sleet when a white medical transport van pulled up to the main gates. The driver stepped out and pressed the intercom button, shivering in the freezing wind. "I have a pickup scheduled by Vivian Wilson," the driver announced through the crackling speaker. "I am here for a mandatory medical transport. I have orders to take Silas Wilson to the Pine Ridge Assisted Living Facility." Vivian had scheduled the transport for the exact day they were supposed to be celebrating in Paris. She had planned for a team of strangers to forcibly remove her own father-in-law from his home while she drank champagne overseas. She wanted him gone before they even landed. I pressed the intercom button, my finger resting heavily on the cold metal. "There is no pickup," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the freezing air. "The transport has been permanently canceled by the owner of this estate. Silas Wilson is not a burden. Silas Wilson is not a patient. Silas Wilson is the master of this house. Turn your van around and never come back." The driver did not argue. He looked at the armed security guards standing behind the iron gates, nodded quickly, and drove away into the storm. I watched the taillights fade into the sleet, feeling the last chain of their control break and fall away. I walked back inside, locking the reinforced door behind me. I set my tactical radio on the hall table and walked back toward the study. Before I could reach the doorway, my Vanguard tablet emitted a sharp, distinct alert tone. It was not a message from the compliance division. It was an automated tracking alert I had placed on Chloe's emergency debit card. She had kept a small secondary account linked to her father's bank, completely separate from the Wilson family funds. The notification detailed a fresh transaction processed just 3 minutes ago. The charge was for 4 one-way tickets departing from Charles de Gaulle Airport and landing in Atlanta. They had been forced to leave their luxury suite. They had been forced to abandon the rest of their vacation. Chloe had emptied her personal emergency fund just to get them out of the country. They were not flying first class. They were not flying business class. They were broke, humiliated, and flying coach. I looked at the flight itinerary flashing on the screen. They were coming back. They were coming back with absolutely nothing left to lose. And they were coming for blood. 10 hours in seat 34B. 10 hours of recycled air, crying infants, and the sharp smell of cheap airline coffee. 10 hours of absolute humiliating misery. Marcus stared blankly at the scratched plastic tray table locked in front of him. He was sweating. He was sweating through his custom-tailored Italian shirt. The reality of the federal freeze was finally setting in, gnawing at his mind with brutal clarity. The offshore account was locked. The $4 million was sitting perfectly trapped in a Cayman shell company with his signature attached to it. It was federal wire fraud. It was international money laundering. It was federal elder abuse. It was an indictment waiting to happen, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Beside him, Vivian was not sweating. Vivian was vibrating with a toxic, unyielding rage. She complained about the lack of legroom. She complained about the stale smell of the cabin. She complained about the flight attendant who had firmly instructed her to return her seat to the upright position. Vivian had never flown coach in her entire adult life. She had never been denied a luxury. She had never been spoken to like an ordinary citizen. The indignity of the commercial flight was burning her alive. 2 rows behind them, Chloe was crying. They were not quiet, dignified tears. They were loud, angry, heaving sobs that drew the irritated stares of everyone in the back half of the plane. She was trapped in a middle seat next to the lavatory, and she was taking every ounce of her frustration out on Jamal. She told him she was calling a divorce lawyer the exact second the plane touched the tarmac. She told him he was a broke fraud. She told him he was pathetic. Jamal sat pressed against the window, silent and shrinking, unable to formulate a single word of defense. He had promised her a logistics empire. He had promised her a $4 million payout. Instead, he had delivered a frozen bank account and an economy ticket back to reality. Every mile across the Atlantic fueled their collective hatred. They hated the cramped seats. They hated the airline. But most of all, they hated me. They blamed me for the declined cards. They blamed me for the humiliation at the restaurant. They plotted their revenge in the dark cabin of the airplane. They would ruin me. They would crush me. They would throw me onto the freezing street with absolutely nothing. That was the plan. That was the only thing keeping them sane. They would ruin me. They would crush me. They would erase me. Back in Atlanta, the winter storm had intensified. The sleet had shifted into thick, heavy snow, blanketing the sprawling estate in a pristine, untouched layer of white. Outside, the wind howled against the reinforced glass. Inside the study, it was warm. It was peaceful. It was the quiet of absolute control. I was not wearing loungewear. I was not wearing a comfortable sweater. I was dressed for a corporate execution. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit with a crisp white silk blouse. My hair was pulled back sharp and flawless. I was no longer the obedient daughter, shrinking in the shadows of their demands. I was the chief executive of the Silas Wilson Trust, and I looked the part. Silas sat opposite me in his high back leather armchair. He held a heavy crystal tumbler of 30-year-old bourbon. The amber liquid caught the golden light of the crackling fire. He took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the warmth settle in his chest. He did not look like a frail old man waiting for a nursing home transport. He looked exactly like the ruthless business titan who had built an empire from the ground up. He looked like a king sitting comfortably in his fortress, watching his enemies march blindly toward the guillotine. The high-definition security monitors on my desk flared to life. The perimeter cameras captured a battered yellow airport taxi pulling up to the main iron gates of the estate. It was not a private black car. It was not a luxury limousine. It was a cheap standard taxi with a dented front bumper and a sputtering exhaust pipe. The taxi jerked to a stop. The back doors flew open. Marcus stepped out into the freezing driving snow. He was not wearing a winter coat. He marched straight up to the security keypad, wiping the wet snow from his face. He punched in his master access code. The keypad flashed a hard, aggressive red. Access denied. He punched it in again, hitting the keys harder this time. Red. Access denied. Jamal ran up beside him, pulling his thin jacket collar against the biting wind. Jamal punched in his personal access code. Red. Access denied. Vivian rolled down the taxi window, screaming at them through the storm, demanding to know why the gates were not opening. They tried every code they knew. They tried the maintenance codes. They tried the emergency override codes. Every single combination returned the exact same fatal red flash. The estate was locked. The estate was sealed. The estate was no longer theirs. Marcus slammed his fist against the reinforced steel pillar housing the keypad. He lunged toward the intercom box, his face contorted with panic and fury. He slammed his palm against the silver call button. The audio feed crackled to life inside the warm, quiet study, bringing the sound of the howling wind directly to us. Naya Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Open this gate right now, or I swear to God I will break it down." I looked across the table at Silas. He raised his crystal tumbler in a silent, approving toast. I did not lean toward the microphone. I did not offer a warning. I did not speak a single word. I simply reached forward and pressed the green release button on the security console. Outside in the freezing snow, the heavy iron gates clicked and slowly began to swing open, welcoming them onto the grounds. The yellow taxi did not even attempt to navigate the long, winding driveway. The driver took one look at the tactical security vans parked near the entrance and the heavily armed guards standing watch and immediately shifted into park. He popped the trunk, demanded his fare in cash, and sped away before Marcus could even finish counting the wet bills. That left the four of them standing at the base of the driveway. The wind was relentless. The sleet had transitioned into a heavy, blinding snow piling up thick and wet, soaking right through their expensive, tailored European coats. Marcus was shivering uncontrollably, his thin Italian leather loafers slipping dangerously on the icy pavement. Vivian was practically hyperventilating, her face pale with exhaustion and fury. Their credit cards were useless. Their bank accounts were frozen. They had no choice but to physically drag their own massive, heavy designer suitcases up the quarter-mile incline. The tiny wheels of Chloe's Louis Vuitton trunk jammed instantly in the accumulating slush. She yanked at the handle, cursing loudly, the sound whipping away in the howling wind. She threatened to divorce Jamal for the fourth time that day, blaming him for the snow, blaming him for the frozen accounts, blaming him for the fact that she was currently carrying her own luggage like a commoner. Jamal tried to help her, but his hands were numb, and he ended up dropping her bag directly into a frozen puddle. Chloe shrieked at him, her voice hoarse from crying on the miserable 10-hour flight in economy. By the time they reached the grand marble steps of the front porch, they were a completely pathetic sight. They were stripped of their usual arrogant polish. Their clothes were soaked and heavy. Their hair was plastered to their faces. They were breathing heavily, panting from the physical exertion of hauling their own luggage through a winter storm. They had spent the entire flight plotting how they were going to ruin my life, how they were going to throw me out onto the street the second they arrived. They were coming for blood, but they looked like absolute casualties. Marcus reached the top of the stairs first. He grabbed the ornate brass handle of the main oak door and yanked it. It did not budge. He yanked it again, his frozen fingers slipping on the freezing metal. He looked up and finally noticed the new heavy-duty biometric scanner bolted directly into the stone frame. Before he could even process the new hardware, two massive private security contractors stepped out from the shadows of the grand portico. They were dressed in full tactical black, their faces impassive, their hands resting casually near their utility belts. They physically blocked the entrance, towering over Marcus and Jamal like stone statues. Vivian pushed past her husband, her overwhelming sense of entitlement blinding her to the very obvious danger in front of her. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at the lead guard's chest. "I am the lady of this house," Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking over the wind. "I demand that you step aside immediately. You work for me. I order you to go inside and arrest that girl right now. She has locked us out of our own property. Do your job and arrest her." The guards did not move an inch. They did not speak. They simply stared down at Vivian with absolute clinical indifference. Marcus slammed his hands against the thick, reinforced glass panels flanking the oak doors. The glass barely rattled. Naya Marcus roared, his voice muffled by the thick insulation. "You are finished. Do you hear me? You are completely finished. I will have you thrown in a federal cell for this. Open the door." Inside the foyer, the heavy silence was broken by the sharp electronic chirp of the biometric lock disengaging. The heavy deadbolts retracted with a loud, heavy thud. The massive oak doors slowly swung inward. The warm, golden light from the crystal chandelier spilled out onto the freezing porch, illuminating the driving snow. I stood perfectly still in the center of the doorway. The cold wind whipped past me, but I barely felt it. My charcoal gray suit was immaculate. My posture was straight. I crossed my arms over my chest and looked down at them. They looked like drowned rats. The contrast between my absolute calm and their frantic, shivering misery was breathtaking. Nia Vivian hissed, taking an aggressive step forward. "You ungrateful little thief! I am going to make you pay for every single second of this humiliation. Where is my father-in-law? Where is Silas? You have manipulated a sick old man and you are going to prison." I did not blink. I did not move out of the way. I simply stood my ground and let the silence stretch. Then the real shock arrived. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the marble floor behind me. They were not the shuffling, hesitant steps of a frail man. They were measured, powerful, and dominant. I stepped slightly to the side, allowing the warm golden light of the foyer to fully illuminate the figure approaching the doorway. Silas Wilson stepped into view. He was not sitting in his wheelchair. He was not leaning on a home care nurse. He was walking entirely unassisted. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his chest broad. He carried his antique, silver-tipped wooden cane, but he was not using it for support. Instead, the heavy cane rested casually over his right shoulder like a baseball bat. In his left hand, he held his crystal tumbler of 30-year-old bourbon. He walked right up to the threshold, stopping just inches from the freezing winter air. He looked down at his son, his daughter-in-law, and his grandson with an expression of absolute Arctic disdain. The reaction was instantaneous. Vivian let out a strangled gasp. Her fingers went completely slack. The heavy chain straps of her quilted Chanel bag slipped from her grasp, and the expensive purse dropped straight down into a pile of wet gray slush. She did not even attempt to pick it up. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. Jamal took a physical step backward, actively hiding behind Chloe. Chloe stopped shivering and simply stared, her mouth hanging slightly open. Marcus looked as if he had just seen a ghost. All the remaining color drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His knees buckled slightly, and he stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the wet marble of the porch. He threw a hand out to catch himself against the stone pillar. His mouth worked silently for a moment, trying to form words that his panicked brain could not process. Dad Marcus finally choked out his voice, nothing more than a hollow, terrified whisper. "You can walk." Silas looked at him. The silence stretched out long and agonizing over the sound of the howling storm. Silas slowly raised his crystal tumbler to his lips and took a smooth, deliberate sip of the dark bourbon. He swallowed, lowering the glass with terrible precision. "I can walk perfectly fine, Marcus," Silas said, his voice ringing out deep and powerful through the freezing air. "I just wanted to see how fast you would try to bury me." Silas stood on the marble threshold, the biting winter wind doing absolutely nothing to diminish the terrifying heat of his glare. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The arrogant sneer he had worn for the last 3 decades had vanished, completely replaced by the trembling jaw of a terrified child caught stealing. His expensive Italian coat was soaked through with melting snow, but the sweat beading on his forehead was entirely from panic. He looked at the cane resting casually on Silas's shoulder, and then looked at the two massive security guards flanking the doorway. He was finally realizing that he had never been the predator in this house. He had always been the prey. Silas took a slow step forward, his boots crunching slightly against the dusting of snow that had blown onto the porch. He looked at Marcus with a profound, crushing disappointment. 30 years, Marcus Silas said, his voice low and dangerous, cutting through the howling wind. 30 years I watched you parade around this city in expensive suits bought with my money. I watched you play the ruthless businessman while secretly draining the corporate accounts to cover your pathetic gambling debts and your failed investments. I let you pretend you were in charge because I thought eventually you would grow into the role. I thought eventually you would learn how to be a man. Instead, you became a thief. Marcus shrank back, his shoulders hunching against the verbal assault. He tried to raise a hand to defend himself, but Silas simply shifted his icy gaze to Vivian. Vivian was shivering violently in her soaked designer coat, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. The woman who had spent her entire life judging the worth of others based on their bank accounts was currently standing in a puddle of freezing slush, completely bankrupt. "And you," Vivian, Silas continued, his tone dripping with absolute disgust. "You smiled and hosted your charity galas, and pretended you were the matriarch of an empire while you actively plotted to throw me into a discount nursing home so you could steal the walls right from around me. You told the lawyers I was losing my mind. You told the doctors I was a danger to myself. You scheduled a medical transport van to drag me out of my own home while you were flying over the Atlantic drinking champagne bought with my stolen credit cards." Vivian let out a pathetic whimpering sound, shaking her head in a desperate attempt to deny it. Silas chuckled, a harsh grating sound that carried over the storm. "I heard every word, Vivian. I heard you both whispering in the hallway. I heard you plotting to forge my signature on the power of attorney. I heard you tell Jamal to drain my personal checking accounts. You thought I was a deaf, oblivious old fool. You thought I was fading away." Silas stepped right up to the invisible line separating the warm foyer from the freezing porch. "You sat at my dining table 3 weeks ago and you told Nia that she had to leave. You told her that in this house, dead weight gets dropped. You are the dead weight, Marcus. You are a parasite, and the host has finally decided to cut you loose." The absolute finality in Silas's voice should have been enough to silence them forever. It should have sent them dragging their ruined luggage back down the long, freezing driveway in absolute shame. It should have broken them completely. But Chloe was incapable of feeling shame. She was freezing, her perfectly styled hair was plastered to her cheeks, and her feet were numb in her soaked boots. Her fragile ego simply snapped under the immense pressure of losing. She shoved past Jamal, nearly knocking him into the icy railing, her face contorted with an ugly, desperate arrogance. "You cannot do anything, old man!" Chloe shrieked, stabbing a manicured finger in the air toward Silas. "You are bluffing. You think you can just stand there and scare us away, but you have absolutely no power here anymore. Jamal and Marcus sold this house. They signed the paperwork. The deed is officially transferred. We have $4 million coming to us right now, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. This is our property. You are trespassing. Get out of my house before I call the police and have you both arrested for breaking and entering." I did not react to her screaming. I did not raise my voice to argue with a woman throwing a temper tantrum in the snow. I simply turned and walked over to the antique console table sitting in the grand hallway. Resting perfectly centered on the polished mahogany surface was a thick, heavy black leather binder. It was the complete finalized closing dossier from the escrow firm. I picked it up, feeling the satisfying weight of their absolute destruction in my hands. I walked back to the doorway, stopping right beside Silas. Chloe was still ranting, still threatening to call the authorities, still clinging desperately to the delusion that she had outsmarted us and won the ultimate prize. I raised my arm and tossed the heavy binder out into the cold. It flew through the air and landed with a heavy, wet thud directly at Chloe's feet, splashing icy slush onto her expensive boots. She stopped screaming mid-sentence, staring down at the embossed silver logo on the black leather cover. "You did not sell the house to a random company, Chloe. I said, my voice carrying clearly through the freezing air, echoing off the stone pillars. You did not outsmart a senile old man and walk away with a fortune. You sold it to Vanguard Restructuring. My company. I am the senior partner. You forged my grandfather's signature and sold his stolen house directly to me. Marcus let out a sound that was half gasp, half choke. His hands flew to his chest, clutching the lapels of his soaked Italian coat as his breathing turned shallow and erratic. He staggered backward, hitting the stone pillar of the porch. His eyes darted from the heavy black binder lying in the slush to my face, and then to Silas. He was hyperventilating the freezing winter air rushing into his lungs in sharp, panicked bursts. The illusion of his absolute control had just been shattered against the cold, hard marble of reality. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I spoke with the cold, clinical precision of a corporate executioner reading a final ledger. Because the signature on the deed was forged, the transfer of the property is completely void. I said, my words cutting through the howling wind like shattered glass. This estate still belongs to Silas. It always belonged to Silas. But the money you received, the $4 million you were so desperate to secure, that was very real. You accepted a massive wire transfer from a federally insured institution directly into an offshore account that you control. You used a fraudulent document to trigger that payment. Marcus shook his head violently, trying to back away from the truth. No, he whispered, his teeth chattering. No, you set us up. You set yourselves up, I corrected him, stepping forward. I just provided the paperwork. The exact second that $4 million hit your Cayman account, you committed federal wire fraud. You committed international money laundering. You used electronic communications to execute a scheme to defraud a federal entity. That is a mandatory minimum sentence, Marcus. There is no fine you can pay to make this go away. There is no politician you can bribe. You walked right into a federal trap, and you locked the door behind you. Jamal finally processed the magnitude of what I was saying. The arrogant smirk he had worn since childhood melted away, leaving nothing but raw animal panic. He dropped his expensive leather duffel bag into the snow and spun around. He did not look at his father. He did not look at his wife. He simply tucked his head and lunged for the steps, desperate to sprint back down the driveway and disappear into the blizzard. He made it exactly 2 steps before the private security guards moved. They did not even draw their weapons. The lead guard simply stepped into Jamal's path, raising a heavy tactical boot and planting it squarely in the center of Jamal's chest. The impact sent Jamal flying backward. He hit the icy porch hard, sprawling onto his back in the freezing slush, gasping for air. Going somewhere, Jamal? I asked, looking down at him with absolute disgust. You cannot run from the IRS. Jamal scrambled to sit up, clutching his bruised chest. What are you talking about? He coughed. Did you really think I would stop at the house? I asked, leaning casually against the stone pillar. Did you actually believe I would let you operate that fraudulent logistics company using the Wilson family name? I know exactly why you needed the $4 million so badly. You needed it to cover the massive gaping hole you dug in your own corporate accounts. Marcus stopped hyperventilating long enough to stare at his son with wide, terrified eyes. I ordered a full forensic audit of your entire operation, I said, ensuring my voice carried over the storm. I handed the files directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS 3 days ago. They have the phantom invoices. They have the fake vendor contracts. They have the routing numbers for the offshore shell companies you use to drain your own clients' funds. Your logistics empire is a complete illusion. You are bankrupt. You are completely broke. And you are both guilty of massive corporate embezzlement. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind continued to scream around the porch, but the 4 of them were entirely frozen. The reality of their total absolute destruction had finally landed. They had nothing, no money, no company, no house, just an impending federal indictment. Chloe stared at Jamal. Her expensive mascara was running down her freezing face. She looked at her husband shivering in a puddle of dirty snow, and the realization washed over her. She was not married to a wealthy heir. She was married to a soon-to-be convicted felon with 0 assets. The luxury vacations were gone. The designer clothes were gone. The status she craved more than oxygen was completely gone. Chloe let out a sound of pure, visceral rage. She ripped her wet leather glove off her left hand with her teeth. She grabbed her massive diamond wedding ring, tugging violently at the cold metal. It stuck for a moment on her freezing finger before she yanked it free, tearing the skin. "I am not going to prison for you ghetto frauds!" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing sharply in the cold air. She threw the heavy diamond ring directly at Jamal. It hit him hard in the shoulder and bounced away, sinking instantly into the deep snow beside the porch. She did not look at him again. She grabbed the handle of her Louis Vuitton trunk, yanking it violently over the marble lip of the stairs. She did not wait for a taxi. She did not ask for help. She simply turned her back on her husband and began dragging her heavy suitcase down the long, dark driveway, plunging straight into the blinding blizzard without looking back. Jamal reached a hand out toward her, but he did not speak. He just sat in the slush, watching his entire life walk away. Vivian watched Chloe disappear into the whiteout conditions, and something inside her finally snapped. The proud, arrogant woman who had spent her life looking down on everyone around her completely collapsed. Her knees buckled. She dropped straight down onto the freezing, wet marble of the porch. Her expensive tailored coat soaked up the icy water. She looked up at me, her face twisted in absolute agony. "Nia," she sobbed, her voice trembling and pathetic. "Nia, please. We are family. You cannot do this to us. Please have mercy." I looked down at the woman who had tormented me for years. I looked at the woman who had tried to throw my grandfather into a facility like trash. I felt absolutely nothing. Through the howling wind, a new sound began to emerge. It started as a faint wail cutting through the trees at the base of the mountain. It grew steadily louder, piercing the heavy snow, the sharp, unmistakable sound of multiple police sirens approaching the main gates. The red and blue lights fractured the blinding white of the blizzard. The sirens wailed louder, tearing through the silence of the remote estate. 3 local police cruisers and a massive black federal SUV broke through the storm, their heavy tires aggressively churning the snow and gravel as they passed through the open iron gates. They swarmed the circular driveway, boxing in the porch. The doors flew open in perfect unison. Uniformed officers and a severe-looking federal agent stepped out into the freezing storm. They did not pause to ask questions. They did not need to assess the situation. They already had the entire narrative. My corporate legal team had hand-delivered the complete physical and digital dossier to the federal prosecutor hours ago. They had the forged signatures on the property deed. They had the digital footprints of the wire transfers. They had the offshore account routing numbers and the undeniable proof of elder financial abuse. The authorities surged up the marble steps, moving with absolute tactical precision. The lead federal agent bypassed me entirely and marched directly toward Marcus and Jamal. Marcus Wilson and Jamal Wilson. The agent barked, his voice cutting through the howling wind. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and felony elder abuse." Marcus let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp. An officer grabbed his arm, spinning him around and slamming him face first into the icy granite pillar of the portico. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed over the storm. Jamal did not even try to resist. He was hauled up from the slush by 2 officers, his soaked designer jacket dragging heavily on his shoulders. He hung his head completely defeated as the cold steel snapped shut around his wrists. Marcus twisted his head awkwardly against the stone pillar, his eyes wide and frantic. He looked past the federal agents. He looked directly at Silas, standing tall and imposing just inside the warm foyer. "Dad," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "Dad, please, you have to stop them. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them it was just a family business arrangement. You cannot let them take me in handcuffs. I am your son. Please." Silas did not step forward. He did not raise his voice. He looked at the sniveling, terrified man pinned against the pillar with eyes like glacial ice. "I have no son," Silas said. The words were quiet, but they carried absolute, devastating finality. Silas turned his back on the porch. He stepped deeper into the warm golden light of the hallway and walked away. The rhythmic, solid tap of his wooden cane faded into the quiet luxury of the house, leaving Marcus to his fate. Officers grabbed Marcus by his soaked collar and dragged him down the steps. They hauled Jamal right behind him, shoving both men into the back of the freezing police cruisers. That left Vivian. She was still kneeling in the freezing slush, her expensive coat completely ruined, her makeup smeared in dark, jagged lines across her pale face. The federal agent stepped in front of her, looking down with clinical detachment. He informed her that while she was not currently under arrest for the wire fraud, she was legally barred from the property. A permanent criminal trespass order had already been filed and activated. He ordered her to vacate the premises immediately, or she would be joining her husband in the back of a squad car. Vivian looked around wildly. Her husband was gone. Her son was gone. Her daughter-in-law had abandoned them. The immense wealth and status she had worshipped her entire life had evaporated into the freezing winter air. She scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking violently from the cold and the shock. She lunged toward the open doorway. The two private security guards immediately stepped together, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle and tactical gear. Vivian reached her trembling hands out toward me. Tears poured down her face, mixing with the melting snow. "Nia," she sobbed, her voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic wail. "Nia, please. I am your mother. You came from me. You cannot do this. You cannot leave me out here in the storm with absolutely nothing." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire existence making me feel small, inadequate, and utterly disposable. I looked at the woman who had prioritized her own vanity and greed over my well-being every single day of my life. I stepped right up to the line of the security guards. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute, unshakable clarity. "You left me at the airport of life a long time ago, Mom," I said, my words slicing cleanly through the freezing wind. "I am just finally catching my flight." Vivian recoiled as if I had physically struck her across the face. The air left her lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. The police officers stepped forward, grabbing her arms and forcing her to turn around. They commanded her to start walking. She looked back over her shoulder one last time, searching my face for a flicker of hesitation or a moment of weakness. She found absolutely none. Vivian turned and began the long, brutal walk down the snowy driveway. Her expensive designer heels sank deep into the freezing slush with every step. I watched her figure grow smaller and smaller, heading out into the dark, unforgiving winter night entirely alone. The heavy doors of the police cruisers slammed shut with a definitive metallic thud. The tires spun briefly on the ice before gripping the pavement. The red and blue lights swept across the snow-covered lawn as the vehicles turned around and headed down the driveway. The sirens wailed briefly before fading away, swallowed entirely by the relentless whiteout of the blizzard. The estate fell completely silent. The only sound left in the world was the quiet rushing of the winter wind through the ancient pine trees. I took a deep breath of the crisp, cold air, letting it fill my lungs. I stepped back into the grand foyer. I placed my hands on the heavy, ornate oak doors and pushed them closed. The solid wood met the frame with a deep, echoing boom, shutting out the cold and shutting out the toxic past forever. The heavy deadbolt slid into place with a satisfying mechanical click, locking me safely inside the warmth of my new life. 6 months can rewrite the entire trajectory of a family legacy. The howling blizzards of that winter night had long since melted away, replaced by the heavy golden heat of a warm Atlanta afternoon. I sat quietly at the head of the massive mahogany table in the primary boardroom of Vanguard Restructuring. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the downtown skyline, but my focus was entirely on the quarterly reports resting in front of me. The logistics company that Marcus and Jamal had nearly driven into the ground was completely unrecognizable now. We had surgically removed the toxic wrought, liquidated the offshore shell companies, and rebuilt the legitimate supply chain operations from the ground up. The business was not just surviving. It was thriving, yielding the highest profit margins the company had seen in over a decade. I closed the financial portfolio and took a sip of my coffee, letting the profound quiet of the boardroom wash over me. The absolute silence was a luxury I had learned to appreciate. It was the sound of absolute victory. Federal prison is exceptionally cruel to men who are accustomed to flying first class and throwing tantrums when their martinis are not mixed correctly. Marcus and Jamal never even made it to trial. My corporate lawyers had assembled a mountain of irrefutable evidence. The forged property deed, the wire transfers, the fake vendor invoices, and the offshore accounts painted a masterpiece of white-collar crime. Faced with the certainty of a brutal public trial and decades behind bars, they both panicked and turned on each other. Marcus tried to claim Jamal masterminded the embezzlement. Jamal swore Marcus forced him to forge the signatures. The federal prosecutor simply smiled and handed them both plea deals. They pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud and felony elder financial abuse. Marcus received a mandatory sentence of 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Jamal received 6. The tailored Italian suits had been permanently traded for standard-issue orange jumpsuits. Chloe had naturally refused to accept reality. The moment the FBI placed Jamal in handcuffs, she immediately filed for a hostile divorce. She hired a notoriously aggressive attorney attempting to sue for massive alimony spousal support, and half of the phantom millions she still believed existed. She spent 3 months raging in courtrooms, demanding a lifestyle that was fundamentally built on stolen funds. The aggressive legal strategy completely backfired. Because all of Jamal's accounts were seized by federal authorities to pay restitution, Chloe had absolutely no way to pay her massive legal bills. Her shark attorney dropped her and sued her for unpaid fees. She lost everything. She was forced to pawn her remaining designer bags just to avoid sleeping on the street. She was officially bankrupt, stripped of the wealthy identity she had prized above human decency. Vivian suffered a fate that was arguably worse than prison for a woman entirely obsessed with social status and appearances. The frozen accounts and the permanent criminal trespass order left her completely destitute overnight. The society friends she had spent decades cultivating immediately stopped returning her phone calls the second the embezzlement scandal hit the local news. The country club revoked her membership. The charity boards removed her name from their letterheads. Vivian was forced to rent a tiny rundown one-bedroom apartment in a noisy complex right next to a busy highway. To pay her rent, she had to take a job working the perfume counter at a mid-tier department store in the local mall. She now spends 8 hours a day on her feet, wearing a cheap polyester uniform, forcing a bright, desperate smile as she sprays samples for the exact same wealthy society women she used to aggressively look down upon. Every single day is a grueling, humiliating reminder of the empire she threw away out of sheer greed. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom clicked open, breaking my train of thought. I looked up, and a genuine smile spread across my face. Silas walked into the room, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. He did not have his wooden cane. He moved with a smooth, confident stride, his posture straight, and his shoulders pulled back. The crushing, oppressive weight of Marcus and Vivian's constant psychological abuse had been completely lifted from his life. He looked 10 years younger, his eyes bright and alert, his silver hair neatly trimmed. He was wearing a sharp, perfectly tailored navy suit that commanded immediate respect. He walked over to the head of the table and looked down at me with immense, overwhelming pride. He did not say a word at first. He simply slid a thick leather-bound legal document across the polished mahogany surface. I looked down at the embossed cover. It was the finalized operating agreement for the newly restructured corporate holding group. I opened the folder to the signature page. My name was already printed in bold letters right under the title of Chairman of the Board. "I signed my portion this morning," Silas said, his voice rich and steady, resonating with absolute clarity. "The lawyers have transferred the controlling shares. The estate, the company, the entire portfolio, it is all fully secured under your name, Nia. You saved my life. You saved the legacy I built with my own 2 hands. Now it is your turn to lead." I picked up the heavy gold pen resting beside the folder. I thought about the years of being pushed aside, the years of watching parasites drain my family, the years of quietly building my own strength in the shadows, while they underestimated me. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with a smooth, fluid motion. The generational wealth of the Wilson family was finally safe. It was permanently locked away from the greedy hands of entitled thieves. It rested firmly and unconditionally in the hands of the one person who had actually earned it, the one person who had the strength to protect it. I looked up at Silas and smiled, handing him the pen. The game was officially over. Checkmate. 6 weeks after that final signature in the boardroom, the summer heat settled over the mountains, transforming the estate into a lush, vibrant paradise. The biting, howling winds and suffocating ice of that miserable Christmas night felt like a distant nightmare. In its place was a brilliant, cloudless blue sky and the rich smell of blooming jasmine and barbecue smoke. The estate was absolutely alive. I stood on the massive stone patio holding a glass of iced tea, watching the sprawling back lawn fill with genuine laughter and joy. We were hosting a midsummer celebration, and the contrast to the toxic, suffocating holidays of the past was staggering. There were no forced formal wear requirements or bitter whispering behind crystal glasses. Instead, the lawn was dotted with my actual support system. My closest friends from college were playing yard games near the fountain. The brilliant corporate attorneys and forensic accountants who had helped me execute the Vanguard restructuring were relaxing in the shade of the ancient oak trees, trading stories and enjoying the catered food. Even better, the patio was filled with the extended family members that Marcus and Vivian had systematically alienated for decades. Aunts and uncles who had been deemed not wealthy enough or not useful enough by my mother were now sitting comfortably on the plush outdoor furniture, reconnecting with Silas. The air was thick with authentic affection. There was no walking on eggshells. There was no fear of a sudden vicious critique about weight or career choices. The poison had been completely extracted from the soil of this family. A sharp, clear clink of a silver spoon against crystal cut through the music and the chatter. The noise on the lawn gradually died down as everyone turned toward the grand stone staircase of the patio. Silas stood there holding a champagne flute. He was wearing a light summer suit, resting his free hand casually on the stone balustrade. The afternoon sun caught the silver in his hair. He looked over the crowd and smiled, a deep, genuine expression that reached all the way to his eyes. "Thank you all for being here," Silas began, his rich voice carrying effortlessly across the lawn. For a very long time, this house was filled with the wrong kind of noise. It was filled with greed and entitlement. I allowed a shadow to fall over this family because I wanted to believe the best about people who only possessed the worst intentions. But a house is just stone and wood. It takes the right kind of spirit to turn it back into a home. Silas turned his head and looked directly at me. The crowd followed his gaze, parting slightly, so there was a clear line of sight between my grandfather and me. "I am standing here today because of my granddaughter Silas," continued, his voice swelling with overwhelming pride. "When she was growing up, the people who should have protected her tried to make her feel small. They tried to convince her she was a disappointment because she refused to play their shallow games. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They mistook her quiet observation for weakness. They did not realize that while they were busy building an empire of lies, she was quietly sharpening a brilliant mind and forging an unbreakable steel spine. She did not just save my life or my company. She saved the very soul of this family." Silas raised his glass higher. "Traditionally, estates of this magnitude carry the name of the patriarch," Silas declared. "But tradition only matters if it honors the truth. As of this morning, the legal paperwork has been finalized with the county. This property will no longer bear the burdens of its past." I raise my glass to the woman who rescued it. "Welcome, everyone, to the Nia Vanguard estate." The lawn erupted in massive, heartfelt applause. My friends cheered loudly, raising their glasses in the warm air. My extended family smiled with deep, genuine approval. I felt a tight, hot lump form in my throat, but I did not cry. I smiled back at Silas, raising my own glass to him in silent, profound gratitude. As the guests returned to their conversations and the music swelled back up, I took a slow, deliberate step away from the crowd. I needed a moment of quiet to anchor myself in the reality of what had just happened. I turned and walked through the heavy French doors, stepping into the cool, air-conditioned grand hallway of the main house. The interior was bathed in golden afternoon light streaming through the massive skylights. I walked slowly down the corridor, the heels of my sandals clicking softly against the polished hardwood. I paused right outside the door to my old bedroom. I looked down at the specific floorboards near the baseboard. That was the exact spot where I used to hide my financial ledgers and the early drafts of the Vanguard LLC incorporation documents. I had spent years sitting on that floor, convinced I had to remain entirely invisible to survive the crushing weight of Vivian and Marcus's narcissism. I kept walking, trailing my hand along the expensive silk wallpaper until I reached the heavy mahogany doors of the primary study. I pushed them open and stepped inside. The room smelled of old paper and lemon oil. I walked over to the massive oak desk where Marcus had smugly sat trying to force Silas into a discount nursing home. I remembered the exact moment I had found the forged property deed in the bottom drawer. I remembered the surge of cold, calculated adrenaline that had flooded my veins. Standing in the quiet study, I realized that the trauma of being the designated family scapegoat had actually been my greatest tactical advantage. Vivian and Marcus had spent their entire lives treating me like a piece of broken furniture, something to be ignored unless they needed to kick it. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they never bothered to look closely at what I was building. They never noticed the late nights studying corporate law. They never noticed the strategic alliances I was forming with Silas's oldest friends. They handed me the perfect cloak of invisibility. They forged me into a weapon capable of taking down their entire fraudulent empire, and they never even saw the blade coming until it was already buried in their chests. I ran my hand across the polished surface of the desk, feeling the solid permanence of the wood. The ghosts of the past were completely gone. There was no more screaming. There were no more cruel comparisons to Chloe. There were no more threats of eviction. There was only the absolute certainty of my own strength. I turned away from the desk and walked over to the massive bay window. I pushed the heavy glass open and stepped out onto the private second-floor balcony. The warm summer breeze caught my hair. Below me, the estate stretched out in a magnificent display of emerald green lawns and ancient trees. The sounds of laughter and music drifted up from the patio, wrapping the property in a blanket of genuine warmth. I rested my hands on the warm stone railing and took a deep, clean breath. A profound, unshakable peace settled deep into my bones. The war was over. The estate was mine. The legacy was secure. I looked out over the horizon, knowing with absolute unyielding certainty that no one would ever be able to make me feel small again. The sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in brilliant shades of amber and violet, reflecting off the pristine glass of the estate. I turned away from the balcony, stepping back into the quiet grandeur of the study, and I looked directly at you. Yes, you, the one listening to this story right now. You know exactly what that kind of hard-won peace feels like, or maybe you are still desperately searching for it in the middle of your own family storm. I want you to hear me clearly today, because for a very long time, I thought I was entirely alone. I thought the crushing weight of being the family scapegoat was a unique punishment meant only for me. I spent decades trying to decode the impossible rules of a game that was completely rigged against me from the very beginning. I exhausted myself trying to prove my worth to people who were utterly committed to misunderstanding me. But the absolute truth is the game within a toxic family is never about winning or finding mutual respect. It is about keeping you small so they can feel big. It is about stripping your resources so they can fund their own delusions of grandeur. When the people who share your blood treat you like a stepping stone, stop trying to make them see your worth. It is a futile, exhausting battle that will only drain the life directly out of your soul. Stop explaining yourself to people who deliberately use your words as weapons against you. Stop handing them the emotional ammunition they need to shoot down your dreams. Instead, let them underestimate you. Let them believe their own arrogant delusions. Let them think you are the failure, the quiet one, the weak link in the chain. Because while they are busy tearing you down, performing for the gallery, and destroying their own foundation, you can quietly focus on your own ascent. You can build your strength in the shadows where their toxic reach cannot infect your progress. You can quietly buy the ground they are currently standing on. I did exactly that. I took every insult, every dismissal, every vicious attempt to erase me, and I used it as mortar to build an absolute fortress. The silence they mistook for submission was actually the sound of me calculating my exact trajectory to the top. I did not just break the cycle of generational trauma. I bought the entire cycle out and restructured the board of directors. I took the very legacy they tried to steal and placed it permanently out of their reach. The discipline required to sit at a holiday dinner table to swallow their insults and smile politely while you hold the keys to their absolute destruction is immense. But the reward for that discipline is a lifetime of unshakable freedom. Society will constantly tell you that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that you must always forgive and forget. But true forgiveness does not mean allowing dangerous people to maintain access to your life or your assets. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is holding toxic people legally and financially accountable for the damage they intentionally caused. Have you ever had to let your absolute success be the ultimate revenge against a highly toxic family dynamic? Did you ever have to smile politely across a room while silently setting a flawless trap they were eagerly building themselves? Have you ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to protect you in order to finally protect yourself? I know the profound isolation of that exact moment. I know the deep crushing grief of realizing that the family you desperately wanted does not actually exist. But I also know the immense, undeniable power that comes right after that realization. The moment you stop seeking validation from a broken system is the exact moment you become unstoppable. Share your story in the comments below. Let this space be a testament to the fact that we are not defined by the people who failed to love us correctly. We are defined by the empires we build from the stones they threw at us. Tell us how you broke free. Tell us how you rebuilt your life when everyone around you expected you to fail. Reading your experiences reminds all of us that survival is not just about escaping the toxicity. It is about fundamentally rewriting the ending of the story on your own terms. Your voice matters, and your victory, no matter how quiet or how loud, deserves to be fully recognized and celebrated. We draw strength from each other, and every time one of us stands up and reclaims our power, it gives someone else the courage to do the same. If my journey of taking back my grandfather's legacy and reclaiming my own undeniable dignity resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving the unimaginable. There is an entire community here dedicated to turning pain into unparalleled power, and we want you to be a part of it. Share this video with someone who might be sitting in the dark right now, wondering if they will ever escape the heavy shadow of their own family. Show them that the light at the end of the tunnel is not an illusion. It is a fire they can ignite themselves. We will continue to bring you stories that validate your struggle, expose the mechanics of toxic behavior, and celebrate your ultimate triumph over it. Until next time, keep your standards high and your boundaries absolutely impenetrable. Remember, the best way to deal with a golden child is to own the bank. Triumphant modern rhythm and blues instrumental music swells, filling the air with a powerful driving bass line and uplifting brass notes echoing the absolute victory of the moment before it slowly and smoothly fades out into complete silence.